Hello, my name is Vanessa, and today I'm going to be speaking about A Different Voice by Carol Gilligan. This is a theory that me and my group have chosen. We have done our best research and our best readings to give you guys the best information that we could. The people that will be helping me with this assignment is going to be Kayla. She's going to explain the first and second transition. Marissa is going to be doing the 3 levels of development. Karina is going to characterize the feminine voice and the development of women's moral judgment. And finally, Kim will be doing our conclusion. Doing my own research and my own readings, I have found a really good quote by Gilligan, which said, "Women's differences is rooted not only in their social subordination, but also in the substance of their moral concerns. Sensitivity to the needs of others and the assumptions of responsibility for taking care led women to attend to voices other than their own, and to include in their judgment and other points of view." To me, this quote means that women are very open and they like to receive information as to give out information, which is very true and is very important for all of us to know. Unlike the work which led Gilligan to her own studies, she purports to take account to both women and men. She strives to emphasize that women, like men, are capable of thinking and acting in a manner associated with justice, and women with the elements more associated with value of care. Gilligan found that men and women use mentally different approaches, and since men have dominated the discussion of moral theory, women's perspective is often not taken seriously and is considered to be less developed and less sophisticated. Gilligan's goal in writing this was to address the historical norms about human development that defaulted men that framed women as having differences. But if we focus more on the woman's side, we will see how important it is for women to speak up just like how men do.
The female voice struggles to resolve in its effort to reclaim itself and to solve the moral problem in such a way that no one is hurt. Gilligan talks about 4 women and what their thoughts were when they were asked about morality. She also discusses when the dilemma of choice enters the center of a woman's life. Now, I'll explain how this all connects together. So let's start by looking at how the feminine voice is affected. As the feminine voice struggles to solve a moral problem in such a way that no one is hurt, the care for and sensitivity to the needs of others are those that mark women as the deficient in moral development. The infusion of filling into their judgments keeps women from developing a more independent and abstract ethical conception in which concern for others derives from principles of justice rather than from compassion and care. In the text, as Gilligan begins to discuss what women had responded to the question about morality, she says, the common thread that runs through these statements, the wish of not to hurt others, and the hope that in morality lies a way of solving conflict so that no one will get hurt. It's striking that it is independently introduced by each of these 4 women as the most specific item in the response to a most general question. What begins to emerge is a sense of vulnerability that impedes these women from taking a stand, what George Eliot regards as the girl's susceptibility to adverse judgment of others, which stems from the lack of power and consequent inability to do something in the world. When women feel excluded from direct participation in society, they seem themselves as subject to a consensus or judgment made and enforced by men on whose protection and support they depend on. Gilligan talks about the story of a divorced middle-aged woman, mother of an adolescent's daughter, resident of a sophisticated university community. The woman told her story and said that as a woman, she never understood that she was her own person. She did not understand that she could make her own decisions. She had always felt as if she belonged to her father, husband, or clergyman. She let it continue because it was less responsibility. The sense of the moral decision is the exercise of choice and the willingness to accept responsibility for that choice. To the extent that women perceive themselves as having no choice, they correspondingly exclude themselves from the responsibility that decision entails. Now I will discuss the development of women's moral judgment. Birth control and abortion provide women with the effective means for controlling their fertility. The dilemma of choice enters the center of women's lives during this time. When a woman considers whether to continue or abort a pregnancy, she contemplates a decision that affects both self and others and engages directly to the critical moral issue of hurting. Since the choice is ultimately hers and therefore one for which she is responsible, it raises precisely those questions of judgment that had been most problematic for women. Now, she's asked whether she wishes to interrupt that stream of life which has for centuries immersed her in the passivity of dependence, while at the same time imposing on her the responsibility for care. The construction of abortion dilemma in particular reveals the existence of a distant moral language whose evolution informs the sequence of women's development. This is the language of selfishness and responsibility, which defines the moral problem as one of obligation to exercise care and avoid hurt. The infliction of hurt is considered selfish and immoral in its reflection of unconcern, while the expression of care is seen as the fulfillment of moral responsibility. So let's review what we have discussed. So today we have discussed how the feminine voice struggles to solve a moral problem in such a way that no one is hurt. We also discussed when the dilemma of choice enters the center of a woman's life. The feminine voice goes from being afraid to speak up and make its own decision to attempting to make decisions that will not hurt anyone. The construction of the abortion dilemma in particular reveals the existence of a distant moral language whose evolution informs the sequence of women's development. And with all this, we will now move on to the three levels.
The different voice, the book talks about women's conception of self and of morality. Within the book that Carol Gilligan wrote, there are three levels. Level 1 being orientation to women's survival, the second being goodness and self-sacrifice, the third being the morality of nonviolence. In this video, I'm going to explain what I've learned while studying the three levels. Let's start by looking at level 1, orientation to women's survival. In this level, the author is explaining self-survival and how some things need to be done no matter the consequences. As women develop, they might find themselves in tough dilemmas depending on the person. Gilligan gives two examples in the book, one being 18 years old who wants an abortion, the other being 18 years old as well who wants to keep a baby. In the first example, the woman who wants an abortion, she had no other thought than that she wanted to get rid of it because it was going to be her last year of school. The second example being the woman who wants to keep her baby, she's excited about having a new life and wanting to get married, but then conflicted at the thought of limited free time for herself. Moving along to level 2, goodness of self-sacrifice. In level 2, the author explains goodness of self-sacrifice in many ways, the main being how women make decisions based on what society thinks. Again, while women face difficult decisions throughout their life, they find themselves with only two choices as a way out most of the time. In one example that Gilligan uses, a 19-year-old who is having trouble being straightforward like a boyfriend. She wishes she could be bold like a boyfriend and tell people how she feels. Her only problem is that she's afraid of hurting people, so she keeps to herself. Another example that is given in the book is a 19-year-old who is facing her second abortion. She feels like there is no way out, either hurting herself or hurting the people around her. She wishes there was another way out, but there isn't. The final example that Gilligan uses is a 25-year-old who is having an affair with a married man and ends up getting pregnant. The married man convinces her to have an abortion. She is not a fan of the idea because she believes that life begins at conception. The woman ended up getting an abortion because she doesn't want to hurt the married man's wife. After getting pregnant again by the same man, she decides to keep the baby. She realizes that this was an opportunity for growth, and it was in fact her decision all along. Following along to level 3, the morality of nonviolence. In level 3, the author is talking about selfishness and responsibility, and by the end of the level, it changes from selfishness to morality. Women tend to grow from the decisions they make and end up learning more about themselves and what they can do better in life. In this level, it gives an example of a 25-year-old woman on page 25 in the PDF who is facing the decision of having a second abortion because she feels like if she does, then she would consider herself a walking slaughterhouse. She makes a list of pros and cons of either keeping the baby or getting rid of it. She then goes off to say the world would be better off if she didn't have a baby because she doesn't need to pay off any debts to herself. She then talks about morality and how it's about what fits the circumstances of what the person they're the ones making the decision. She begins to see her power and self-worth, so she decides to do what she wants to satisfy her own needs. She now sees abortion as a serious decision and proceeds with it with careful thought. By the end of her interview, she learns that in order to succeed and get what she wants, she must have ambition in order to have power and responsibility. Finishing off, let's review what was said. Today we talked about the three levels that are found within Gilligan's book in a different voice. Level 1 being orientation to individual survival, which explains how sacrifices need to be made in order to survive. Level 2 being goodness of self-sacrifice, which talks about how women make decisions based on what society thinks. And level 3 being the morality of nonviolence, which is about morality and responsibility that correlates to decision making as you grow. These three levels have had an impact on the study of how women feel and think when going through these decisions that men will most likely never experience.
Throughout life, a woman goes through certain changes in her development of moral judgment. Within the first and second levels of this development, there are two different stages of transition. Based on Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice, the first involves a transition from selfishness to responsibility, and the second, a transition from goodness to truth. Today, I'm going to share what I have learned about these two transitions within the development of women's moral judgment by explaining the changes that women go through and how their decision-making evolves from selfishness to responsibility and from goodness to truth. We will start by looking into how women develop from selfishness to having a feeling of responsibility for their actions. In the first transition, a woman goes from being self-centered to obtaining a newfound moral sense of responsibility. As women grow out of childhood, they begin to think more realistically and more about the responsibilities that they have to endure. In Gilligan's book, she tells the story of a pregnant 17-year-old who decided to have an abortion. The story on page 12 of the PDF explains how initially the girl was excited at the thought of having a baby due to her own sort of selfish needs to not feel as if she were alone anymore. However, she continues to explain that she later realized how much responsibility it actually takes to take care of a baby, and how from that she decided it would be in her best interest to have an abortion. This type of shift in morals takes place in most women at some point in their life and causes a change in how they handle their selfish desires and how they replace those desires with taking responsibility. Along with this first transition, there is another major one that takes place throughout a woman's life. In the second transition, a woman changes morally from focusing on goodness to focusing on truth. Initially, in a woman's moral judgment, they first judge their actions by whether it is good or morally right. As a woman advances in her moral judgment, she starts to consider which action would truly be best for herself and others around her. On page 18 of the PDF of Gilligan's book, she tells another story about yet another young pregnant woman faced with the dilemma of abortion. The woman explains that based on her strict Catholic morals, to her it is still taking a life, but she also has to think of hers, her son's, and her husband's life. She decides that she should have an abortion even though it is against her morals, because of the many burdens that another child would put on not just her, but her entire family. As depicted in this situation, women transform from choosing their actions based on what the right thing is in their eyes to choosing actions based on the reality and the truth of their situations. It is from this transition that women begin to use rational thinking in deciding what actions they take. With all of that, let's review the main ideas here. In discussing how women transition in each of their levels of moral development, I have spoken of the two types that can be found within these levels based on Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice. The first being a woman's transition from having selfish motives to her making responsible decisions, and the second being her transition from basing her actions on what her consciousness tells her is right to what the truth is about her current situation, whatever it may be. Ask any woman to recall how she made decisions when she was an adolescent and compare that to how those decisions would be different now that they are older, and they will realize these patterns in themselves. These transitions are the stepping stones in how the female mind develops throughout life and how female morality changes within a woman's lifetime. And that brings us to the conclusion of this theory.
Today, we have discussed the changes in women's moral judgment throughout the duration of their lives. This includes discussing the two transitions, the three levels, and the characteristics of the feminine voice, as well as the development of women's moral judgment. In the passage A Different Voice by Carol Gilligan, the author dives deeper into the astounding differences between men and women. Beginning in Karina's section, we learn that the feminine voice struggles to solve a moral problem in such a way that no one is hurt. Then, as Marissa informed us, there are three levels of maturity, which is pre-conventional, in which obeying the rules is important because it is a way to avoid punishment. Then there's conventional, which is when one is obeying the rules in order to conform to social constructs. And finally, there is post-conventional maturity, which is the ethical reasoning one uses to make decisions based on things such as rights, values, principles, and more. Lastly, in the two transitions, as stated by Kaylee, a woman first transitions from selfishness to responsibility, and then from goodness to truth. As Kaylee stated, women transform from choosing their actions based on what is right thing in their eyes to choosing actions based on the reality and truth of the situation. All in all, as Vanessa said, women, just like men, are capable of thinking and acting in a manner associated with justice, and women with elements more associated with value and care. Thank you.